What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of 10X Recruiting, brought to you by MetaView. Sile, it's the holidays, man. What do you got planned?
Thanksgiving. That's we don't do that over here.
Why not? Did we win that one too? Did we take that from you?
What was there to be thankful for? No, I'm joking. To be fair, obviously with growing US team, we think about this stuff more. So no major plans, but looking forward to general festivities over the next couple of months.
Awesome. I love it. So today we talked to somebody who I think is criminally underfollowed on LinkedIn. His name is Dan McCarthy. He's the head of talent at Paradigm, which is like the largest crypto VC in the world. What were your takeaways?
My biggest takeaway, and it's sort of like very much after my own heart in terms of the way I think about a lot of the things practically he talks about, but the theme for me was a lot of the underlying theme of what he shared was about focusing essentially on the things that aren't going to change. So I think a lot of people, when there's some disruption happening in the world, don't get me wrong, you should think about what is going to change, of course, but it's also really helpful to think about what's not going to change. What is so sort of like baked into the genetic code as a species or whatever it might be, or just how society works, that it's not going to change. So for him, sort of the two things that were most sort of like prevalent were, well, relationships are still going to matter. So like, let's really like lean into relationships. And then the other thing was literally the sort of the consumption, his media consumption was almost, he was talking about how it's increasingly like focusing on classical things, like, whether it's history or classical literature, whatever it might be. So I think like this, either one like very practical and tangible to the role. The other is just more general. It seems to is had this sort of like return to focusing on things that aren't going to change, focus on the things that have stood the test of time in the past. And there's, that's your platform to think about your next move as an operator. So a little bit philosophical, but that was my sort of like net takeaway.
I totally agree. My biggest takeaway was recruiting basically has two jobs. One is don't drop the ball. He said it in a lot of curse words, which I will not repeat for the intro. You'll hear it in the conversation. And the other one's be dynamic, like as a human being. And so if you think about recruiting, he's exactly right. Like we're just like kind of like moving the ball forward. We're building relationships with people. But when we're building relationships, it's important that we're interesting. We can make people laugh. We have like feel. And Dan talked a lot about that. And I feel like it's very under-discussed, that part of the art. And we went super deep on it. So honestly, one of my favorite conversations of the year. We've had some amazing ones. But like Dan, if you don't follow him, you must follow him right now on LinkedIn. Like he is so good. So I hope you guys enjoy this one. Here's my conversation with Dan. This is 10X Recruiting, a podcast from MetaView. Let's get after it. Dan, what's up, man? It's good to see you.
Yeah, man, you too.
All right. So I think you are criminally underplayed on social media. Like, I feel like you should have 100 times the amount of followers and eyeballs on your stuff. And so today I'm going to solve that problem because I'm going to bring up Dan's greatest hits and we're going to go through these so people can understand like the way that you think. And specifically, you influence a lot of my thinking. I want to start with like one of your last posts, which is like, how do you know if someone is good? Give me the breakdown of what does this post mean and how did you think about solving this problem?
I guess zooming out, like most candidates are not good. I think like when you're talking about who's good, you're talking in the context of like a venture funded startup where like the definition of success is doing things that the vast majority of people are not capable of doing. So I think people are good who have previously done very difficult things. And a lot of those things are often not done in a professional context. I think this also came from just like a long time looking at people where you got to kind of make snap judgments on the basis of like a pretty short career trajectory. So you got to find out what's meaningful to people. And a lot of the time that's stuff that is not about work.
Yeah. So like by definition, right? If we say like the top 5% of people are good, it means 95% of people are not, right?
Yeah. And that's
like,
also a function of who you know. Like, I mean, everything about your judgment is a product of just like who your relationship base is. And so if you hang out with the 49ers all day, like your bar for like what's a good squat max is going to be very different than if you work at like, I don't know, a trading floor.
Exactly. So in the post, you said about relationships. You say relationships and judgment don't scale. Why is that true?
Well, I mean, relationships don't scale because your time is finite. Like you as a person can only really know so many other people to a degree that you have like meaningful information about who they are, what they want, who they are as a person, and whether they would perform in a new environment. This is why executive search firms exist. It's so they can stay close to that like very small circle of elite people in a particular skill set or role. And then judgment doesn't scale in part because your judgment is a product of those relationships. Like when you think about like who do you think is smart? Who do you think is virtuous? Who do you think is competent? You're really just making relative judgments on the basis of like the most smart or virtuous or competent people you know. That's extremely difficult to take from one person and say like, here's this playbook and put it on somebody else, which is why recruiting is in hell. It's not in a good place.
How much of that do you think can be supplemented with like modern learning techniques? I think about reading. I think about like podcasting. I think this is informing more and more of my worldview. And so how does that play in?
You can get closer to automating some of the judgment part in the sense that like, if you were to split recruiting into like the sort of stack ranking or evaluation piece and the selling piece, like the stack ranking part is going to get easier. Like you'll be able to take all of the publicly available information on somebody, synthesize it, and come up with like a pretty defined judgment on like, hey, tell me if this person's good. There's certainly some background information that's not going to be captured in there, like back channel references and like just other stuff. But that part is getting better. The part that is still very difficult to automate, even with AI, is the relationship part, selling. Do you want to spend 60 hours a week working with this person? That part, attention is scarce. It's not going anywhere.
You do mention in the post, you have this line that's relationship quality is mostly a product of time spent working closely with someone. And like what I always like to say is there is no substitute for time. And so if that's true, and we both agree on that, isn't the ideal process for recruiting execs starting by just like always meeting and being around the best people? Like, especially even before like a role opens, like, wouldn't you say that that's the best way to do things?
Yeah. Which is also where it's very hard for most firms to hire execs, because a lot of success there is a product of a relationship that existed for years before this search ever began. So usually whenever I'm talking to a firm and they're talking about starting a new search, like the block and tackle is like always the same. It's like, go out and find who the 100 best people are, get in touch with them and get into their decision loop when they decide to make a move, because they're going to be in control of that process. But a lot of the time, you have to earn that right to be in that decision loop over the course of previous years of conversations that involved giving them high value information or access to like a role that wasn't previously visible to them. So there's a lot of like compounding returns on like building those relationships over a long period of time. And, as we move further into a future where like AI is involved in everything, like a lot of things are going to be financialized and going to look more like liquid markets, like basically all of the returns in those get driven to the highest performers, a small number of really competent people. And you just got to be close to those people, even if it requires like, you investing in that relationship years before you expect it to pay off.
You're describing something I've been thinking about, which is like in the era of AI, there's going to just be like all of the rewards are going to accumulate to the very top end of the population.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I definitely believe, and you can kind of see this across like a lot of different parts of just life, where like the internet in general and AI more recently is kind of generating an environment where just things move faster, feedback loops move faster. And because of that, the best people get more reps, get more attention, and there's more concentration of value in what those people can do. And I think that's going to change the way companies look pretty significantly. Might not be on like a super short timeline, but it's going to be weird.
Yeah, it's happening for sure. But it's like one of the things you're saying is like the way to defend against it. Like one of the defenses against it is just having like an incredible network and investing in that network and knowing really great people and continuing to add value in those relationships. Is that what you're saying?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you have kids, I have kids. You have a very finite amount of time to like spend with other people, and spending it on people who are not super high value hurts. Like you only have so many relationships, and especially as you get older, like it really matters to like keep that concentrated.
Man, you're getting into like one of my life mottos, which is like, I want to give and I want to help people as much as possible. But specifically when like someone burns me, it is like over. Like I remember like ex-girlfriends never talked to ever again, like once the relationship ends. But it's actually funny to hear you describe it from like a networking and just being in recruiting. Like we just don't have time. Like that's the reality. It's like we don't have time, and we have to think about the law of compounding. Who are you going to like
put those chips behind.
I think that's like a Naval thing. It's just like personal relationships compound like anything else. You only need 5 friends. But yeah, like on the professional side, like if you have a really tight relationship with 100 people who are like chief compliance officers at like New York City funds, that's a whole career. Like that's all you need.
So the next one that I love is you had this post about a year ago, and you said the best interview question is tell me your life story. Why? Why is that the best interview question?
Most people, work is not the most important things in their lives, and it shouldn't be. And I think this is kind of like a founder brain, employee brain thing, where like as a founder, you are always interviewing for people who are as jazzed about the company as you are, and that's just like not realistic in some ways. Like for most people, like the stuff that they care the most about in life is going to be their partner, their kids, their like hobbies. It's just other stuff, and like work is like a means to an end of achieving that stuff. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what that means is that like where the most signal is about that person's competence as a person is not going to be in like their professional life. It's going to be like, how did they choose where to go to college? How did they adapt when moving to a new city? Like, what's the hardest thing they've done independent of work? So yeah, like I think those stories are often just like a lot more legible, like to you as a conversation partner, because you don't know what's going on in another company and like whether the project that they went through was really complex or whether their uptime was really good. But you can understand like, hey, what is it like climbing to Machu Picchu? Like, what is it like dealing with a parent who went through like a health problem? It's just more universal, and like you can find out what really drives people and like whether they've actually been through hard things or they just can talk a good game about their professional work.
It's a really interesting take, and I think it's like pretty counter to what most founders or how most founders interview. Most founders are interviewing basically like, hey, I want you to do this thing and do this thing really well. And so tell me about how you've done this thing at other places.
Yeah.
That's basically the conversation. But you're arguing actually that like outside of work things are more important. I see it for like earlier stage talent. What's the bull case for the later stage talent?
Yeah, I mean, for later stage talent, like you definitely want somebody to be like an extension of the founder's brain to a certain extent in whatever like their specialist domain area is. But you can kind of see how people's like lives shake out over time. And like that's a pretty good signal about intelligence and competence. Even if you are hiring somebody who's like later in their career, established, like doing a very specific thing, if you're a 20-person startup, like that person's job is going to be 4 different things over the course of 2 years. And so like what's high signal is like certainly their ability to be like a domain expert, but also like how do they parachute into an unfamiliar situation, and like how much do you want to work with them when they're under stress? And there's like a lot of signals in that in their personal life.
My favorite question is, tell me about the hardest thing that you've done in your life. What do you think about that question? Do you think it gets at it?
Like all of these questions, like what's the hardest thing? Like, tell me about yourself. Where are you from? Like these are all sort of just platforms that allow people to talk about like what matters to them. And that's like kind of the jumping off point for a larger discussion where you're trying to get to the core of like what motivates somebody. You can't ask somebody that directly because like that's not really how people answer that question. You have to kind of like lead them into it through their actions. Natural. Yeah, totally. Then all of a sudden it feels like therapy instead of like, you know, what do you do with your free time? Which is like a super high signal question. But like if you were asking people like, what do you really value? Like they don't want to answer it the same way. But yeah, you just got to ask people why they do stuff.
What you're getting at though is that like these are the jumping off points, and then the real mastery is in these follow-up questions.
Yeah, although I would be lying if I said that there are like perfect follow-up questions. You kind of just ask like, why? Like, why'd you make that decision? Why'd you do that?
That's so funny you mentioned that, because it is kind of like the mid-twit sort of thing, which is like, you know, like why is like what the you know the mid says, and then like the super also just says like why.
Everything is midwit memes. I think like that was actually like another sort of relatively recent realization, is that when I was in the middle of my career, I was extremely process driven. Like every interview process has to have these things. Like here's how to structure this. Like you have to have like very defined rubrics. If you look at both ends of the spectrum, the like, you know, the dumb guy and the genius, it's like it's all vibes. It's just vibes. Like the key is that the person making the vibes-based decisions has to be an extremely well-calibrated judge. But the person making the vibes-based decisions, who is just choosing on the basis of vibes, is usually going to make better decisions than like even an extremely rigorous process that's run by people who are like, fine.
Dan, that is like literally entirely counter to what I learned at Google from 2012 to 2015, right? At Google, it's like we do structured interviews. There's science behind this. Like we want to remove all bias. So help me understand where I like, and I obviously agree with you, but like you're playing devil's advocate, why that like you get to this vibes-based outcome when you do become, at the top of the echelon, the top of the mountain for the stuff you do.
Because people hate making decisions. This is something that like also came up at Google that I was talking about with somebody here the other day. So in like 2012 or 13, I think we might have both been there, like Google came out with this thing where they were like, hey, this internal research suggests that like you really only get signal from the first like 5 conversations,
Exactly.
and that like anything else is just like diminishing returns. And so they created some system where you had to like escalate to like a VP to get approval for these additional conversations if a candidate had already done 5. And like the idea was this is going to like accelerate decision making, but it ended up completely slowing things down because like just nobody wanted to pull the trigger. And I think that was sort of emblematic of the process, which is that like when you get that many cooks in the kitchen, nobody feels solely responsible for the hire. And like when you have one person who's extremely confident in what they need out of the hire, usually a founder, who feels like existential dread if they don't get it over the line, and who is just a really good evaluator of people, everything runs incredibly rapidly, and like that person can own the decision and live with the consequences of failure. So like that's all you need. Like as a recruiter, you're just trying to like replicate that one person's decision-making process in the entire rest of the system.
It's so interesting you're mentioning. So a couple of weeks ago, we had this MetaView event. We had like 60, 70 talent leaders. And one of the things that I was like on my soapbox on is like, at Google, they basically told you not to think about what it would be like to be in the trenches with this person for 60 hours a week. They wanted you not to think about that. I remember specifically like one of the questions people used to ask, like at the debrief, was if you were stuck in an airport with this person for 18 hours, would you enjoy it? And that was like a highly biased, like, don't think about that anymore. Like, get this shit out of here sort of a thing. And I think we ran the experiment. And what we found was that it sucks working with people that you don't like working with.
I mean, not to get too deep in the weeds on Google hiring, but I think it's just like a classic case of like institutional failure. And it's like extremely difficult. And like they did a lot of the early things right about like systematizing everything. Like every large tech company still runs on like the interview structure that they put together. But it's just really, really hard to hire at scale when you're not going to work directly with the person who you're interviewing.
The other thing that I've since come around on is that it turns out when you've built the best monopoly the world has ever seen, none of it matters.
Yeah, you have a cash machine. Like
none of it matters. It doesn't matter. The same is true for Meta and many of like the big FANG companies. It's like these are as close to monopolies as like Standard Oil as we can get in the modern time. And so like it just doesn't matter. Like their processes are not meant to be replicatable, because like the business model is the best in history. And so if you don't look at the business model first and earnestly say like, well, it doesn't matter if they hire Nolan because he sucks or Dan because he's great, because like the thing's going to just keep working.
Yeah. I mean, LinkedIn, also a testament to a product that with powerful network effects
Doesn't matter.
cannot be escaped. Doesn't matter. We'll see if that goes away, but
yeah. All right. The next one, you had a post around it. Like, it was basically like, hey, like, here's 18 years on recruiting, living in San Francisco, Silicon Valley. And you said a recruiter has 2 jobs. What are those 2 jobs?
And the first one is don't fuck it up. And like, it's basically just be conscientious. Like a huge amount of recruiting is just doing a series of like tasks that don't require, frankly, a huge amount of intelligence, but need to be done like precisely and in a timely manner. You're writing a job description. You are organizing feedback. You're getting a debrief wrangled. You're working with a hiring manager to think through some org design thing. Not that complex, but like doing those things fast and just like not letting stuff fall through the cracks is really important. And the other piece is like polish. So the first piece is like functionally it's like coordination. And the polish piece is just like being an extension of like the founder or hiring manager's brain. But yeah, you don't have to be that smart to do that. And I think that was probably the post that I took the most heat from a mix of former colleagues.
Why do you think you took the most heat from it?
Because you don't have to be that smart to be a recruiter, and you should be the dumbest person at your company. If you are not, you could probably be working someplace better, or you're kidding yourself about how smart you are.
That's really well said. Yeah. The attention to detail thing is like obvious, right? Like everything in recruiting is just making sure the ball is still rolling. And ideally, like, can you accelerate the ball rolling down the hill? Like that is like really where it's magic on just kind of like the process stuff. You use the term polish. I actually don't think that's what you're getting at in the post. I think what you're getting at in the post is charisma and like being a dynamic human communicator. How did you build those skills? Like, and how do you continue to improve those skills, like of being sharp and interesting and funny?
There's a component of that that's like, you know, you're hanging with the boys in college and you're riffing, but like over time, that just becomes like your professional environment. Like you need to spend time around like smart and locked in people to kind of keep that going. But really, like what you are trying to do is be a representative of the best of like the company, such that the person who's in front of you is capturing signal about what the other people who work at this company are likely like. The short answer is like the only way you stay sharp is by being around other sharp people. And so the fact that I get to hang out with like Alana and Matt and Katie and Nick Martich and like everybody on the team here, like you got to be on your game if you're going to be in that room.
All day, every day. The other piece is the content diet. You know, I think, you know, it's very similar to like the stuff you put in your mouth is ultimately, you know, the shape of your body and how that ends up looking. The stuff that you put in your brain, we're just so much less aware of because it doesn't show physically. If I eat crappy for a week, I get skinny fat. Like that's how my phenotype works. If I just consume Instagram for a week, like my feed looks like shit, but you can't tell I look the same. What does your content diet consist of?
This is definitely something I think about a lot, especially in the context of just like having kids and like worrying that, you know, we're in a near future, like short form video, like hostile information environment where your kid is just going to be like huge and powerful institutions are dedicating enormous amounts of like money and compute to like making you watch slop. And like, I think resisting that impulse is like super, super important. With respect to like my information diet, not to say that I'm perfect about that. A lot of it is a mix of like Twitter and then stuff I would describe as like Lindy, for lack of a better term, where it's like Lindiness as a concept is like the longer something has existed, the longer it is likely to exist in the future. So that means the stuff that you should pay the most attention to is the stuff that has been around the longest. Ideas, art, literature, behavior. And yeah, I read a lot of like the classics. I listen to a mix of like history podcasts. I read a lot of Wikipedia. Yeah, a mix of that stuff. And unfortunately, Twitter, which is still the center of the universe.
Okay. So I want to take a beat on Twitter. So I feel like this past week, I've been doing this thing to where I've like been trying to interact with more real humans, and I live in Salt Lake City. And so I'm typically interacting with like tech people who are doing recruiting here. Twice in the last week, met with really smart gals who I think are like strong up and comers in recruiting. And somehow like the conversation has turned to Twitter, and neither of them are on Twitter. And I was like, I don't know how you learn. Somebody asked me a couple of years ago, JC Jorgensen asked me like 6 or 7 years ago, and I was at Carta. She's like, Nolan, how do you learn? And it like really like stopped me in my tracks. I was like, fuck, I don't know. I got to think about this. And essentially what I came up with was like books, especially books that have been around for a long time. And then I came up with Twitter. Like I'm learning a ton on Twitter, specifically like VC Twitter, you know, what's kind of happening in the ethos right now in tech. It feels like it's happening there. Like, what is it about Twitter to where you and I are both learning a ton there?
It is the best and the worst of humanity in a single place. It's speed. Like everything happens there and it happens as quickly as possible. The idea of being somewhere else for news is like sort of weird to me. Like I don't know. Everything else is just way slower. I think like within crypto and investment specifically, like there is a risk of just being in like, you know, kind of the take chamber. And like everything is just like a dumb argument. And like you have to kind of like stay above that. But like some of the like highest signal stuff, usually about like tech and venture, is on there. And I mean, it's the stuff I think about every day. Like a lot of the time when I come home from work, like my wife and I are having a conversation about like something one of us saw on Twitter.
Isn't that interesting? It's so interesting. Like when you're really, really in the bubble, like that is like the bubble that we all like look at, and it's incestual.
Yeah. And like being in San Francisco, it's especially extreme just because you have this kind of overlapping like city politics and like tech industry, and it's all the same people talking about the same stuff all the time. There's like a right bar where like, you don't want to be like too online, but
Yeah.
you also can't log off completely. Yeah, you gotta finally calibrate.
Yeah, terminally online is the name of the game. All right. So the last one is a few months ago, you had a post on how you think AI is going to change recruiting. So what's your take? How do you think it's going to change recruiting? Where are we going?
I think it's probably going to change less than most other fields. Some of that is because people still really want attention. And I think that is the thing that is always going to be scarce. So that you can kind of break it out into like you can break recruiting into two sort of core functions, right? One is like the stack rank, and the other is selling or like engaging. So if you had like a perfect machine and you were like, hey, here's a job description, bring me back the best people for this. One component of that is like with perfect fidelity coming up with a list of like, here are the people who would execute on this job the best. And that part I think is like, computers are certainly getting better at that. It's not flawless, but it's like, in the near term, I think there's going to be like a productized version of what like a pretty good sourcer would do. And so that's going to change the job a little bit, but it does not really help you engage those people. And that's where I think the like long-term relationship building, being really precise with your selling motion, that piece is going to help. What I think is not going to be that useful is like any kind of AI tools that are related to like evaluating people outside of like very narrow, like, code evaluation kind of things.
Really?
Yeah, mostly because I think people are going to be incredibly hostile to them. I think the idea of like, hey, like get into the process and interview with this like AI bot outside of like very block and tackle like service industry kind of jobs, like nobody's going to want to do that. And they're going to perceive it as a huge negative about like the investment of like the leadership team or like other people in the company in this hire.
I think I agree with you, but I don't know. Like on the services industry, essentially what you're saying is like, I think there's a product, I think it's called Paraform. But anyways, there's a product that Chipotle uses to hire line workers, right? And basically what it does is like, it's like an AI bot where you're just kind of like texting with the thing. I've heard where they want to take this thing, which is there's then like, great, you meet the minimum qualification. Then there's like a one-way dynamic AI-based interview to like screen that person as like a normal human would, but without obviously the human. I hear everybody complain, both on the recruiting side, as well as like on the candidate side, about companies, larger companies that have big brands, to where like the inbound is just literally too much for humans to go through. And so do you think that there's like a place there to like help the stack ranking piece of like, if you can articulate to a candidate why doing this thing on your own time will help you actually like stand out from others? Like, do you think that that's part of the future?
Yes, but I think that is probably not the problem that most companies have, and not the problem that most companies will have in the future as headcount diminishes and as we enter a noisier environment where like the best people have more options and are just constantly being hit up for new things. I think that like certainly for, a Google or Coinbase, like it is valuable for them to use some form of screening tools very early in the process. But I think that the problems that most companies have with recruiting are not like, hey, we have this flood of applications and we need to evaluate people more efficiently.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's more like we already kind of know who's good. How do we like automate the legwork of getting in front of those people and like sell ourselves effectively so that we can earn the right to have a conversation with them?
One thing you missed in that post is the importance of relationships in the era of AI. So like my take is like the more AI we have, the more we yearn for true human connection. Like, you agree with that?
Yeah. Screen bad. Screen is bad.
Yeah, we're going to have these holograms though. But like specifically for recruiters though, I feel like this is actually where there's alpha. If you are really good with humans, like if you're dynamic, if you have that charisma, if you can build relationships with people, I feel like you're actually going to really stand out in this next era. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think like one framing of this that I have heard is basically that like intelligence on any given topic is trending downward in cost, but it is very difficult to automate the way that you make somebody feel. And because of that, it's sort of like bearish IQ, bullish EQ. Certainly, I think those things are tied together to a certain degree, but I think the ability to like be genuine and convince somebody, hey, like you should come work here because I and the rest of this organization are high value people who will treat you the right way and like we're aligned around the outcome that we want to achieve. Landing that message is going to be very, very important.
Wow. I've never heard it articulated like that, but I think like when you say it, I think there's people who come into my brain that I think about that like make me feel a certain way, that make me like want to be in the trenches with them. And I feel like, especially in the era, like you had mentioned this, like headcount is shrinking. And I think people are running away from that fact. I think it's kind of like a slow and then all at once sort of situation is where we're moving towards there. But man, like really where there is alpha is like, can you make people feel a certain way? Like, can you like rile up their emotions in a way that the screen cannot?
For sure. Yeah, you need the reality distortion field. And I mean, I know I leave meetings with the right people, like ready to like run through a wall. I mean, we're going to enter a future where like so many things are going to be less scarce. I don't think that's going to be on an incredibly short timeline, but like interpersonal relationships are not going anywhere. They're very hard to replicate. They require investment. And yeah, you want to spend time around the people who make you feel good.
How are you like defending against this? You know, I had a friend the other day who's in VC describe it as like, I'm building these little sand castles and his business is growing like, you know, 2x year over year. Or it has a huge base, like they're killing it. And he's like, but I feel like I'm just building these little sand castles and the tsunami is coming. The AI tsunami is coming. How are you thinking about that for your own like self? Are you trying to defend against it in any way? Are you trying to like, are there things that you're doing right now to protect against the tsunami?
Yeah. I mean, to zoom way out, like, I think it's very important to think about like what society is going to be like 20 to 40 years from now when my kids are adults. Like, I don't think anything is going to change on the next like 10-year time cycle, 5 to 10-year time cycle, to the extent that like, you know, my career is going to be like radically dislocated. Things could change pretty significantly, but I think like I'm less worried about myself and more worried about my kids. The best way to prepare for a future where things are going to change as fast as I think they are is to give yourself a foundation of stuff that is like very low in the hierarchy of educational needs, meaning I would not want my kid to major in computer science. I would say you should probably think about a platform like philosophy or like physics. I also think the higher education system is going to completely collapse by the time my kids get to college, which they're now 6 and 4. So I would be pretty worried if my kids were like 12 and 14. It's going to be good to have space, land. Like, it's going to be a very different world. And to your point, I think like there are going to be many, many companies that are much smaller in headcount and people will have like much more power as individual entrepreneurs. There are going to be careers that emerge that are like way weirder than we thought would be before. Nobody knew what an influencer was 20 years ago, but I think like
Totally.
things will be even faster and weirder in the near future. To summarize, it's like you keep learning about stuff that was valuable 1,000 years ago, and you hope that that's like still useful in an environment where technology is much, much more powerful than it is today.
The human things. Yeah, I agree. I think it's the human things. Dan, again, the goal of this was like, I want to make sure people know about you and can follow you. So where can people follow you and get your most up-to-date thinking?
Twitter, D McCarthy 7, although I think that is probably more like, you know, gripes about like San Francisco public transit or, you know, tech industry stuff. That's probably the main place, that and LinkedIn, which, yeah, I think the less said about that, the better.
Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, man. Talk to you soon.